So, the topic today is nature and nurture, that old bugaboo. I'd like to use my time today to talk to you about a trait that we've come to think of as our most natural and moral mode, sincerity, the alignment of inner thoughts and feelings and beliefs with their outward expression, or truly expressing what you believe and feel, no matter how accurate, interesting, or relevant, a little bit like Facebook. Today, I'm going to tell you a 15-minute story, or 18 if they're generous, about the cultural history of sincerity, and one that spans 500 years. I'm going to talk about some long-deceased writers and thinkers who propelled the value of sincerity as an important moral mode into the present. It's from them that we've inherited our own understanding of sincerity, even if in our own times it's become rightly suspect. I want to show you today that although sincerity feels very natural, it is in fact also very cultural. And hopefully this will pique your interest for reading more about it. I happen to know the author of a book about exactly this topic. Oh, how'd that get in there? We tend to think of sincerity as a human trait today, but it wasn't always so. At the word's origins, sincerity designated physical materials that were pure or unadulterated: milk, honey, wine, precious stones, glass. This makes sense, as the word stems from the Latin word sincerus, which means clean, pure, or sound. The word eventually comes to describe human affairs, and at a very telling time, the Protestant Reformation of the 16th century. In fact, the first time the word sincerity is used in English is in 1533 by a Protestant reformer named John Frith, who was English. In a letter to Sir Thomas More, the Chancellor to King Henry VIII, Frith described a long-dead Oxford scholar named John Wycliffe as a man who had lived a, quote, very sincere life. John Wycliffe, you may recall, was the man who translated the Latin Bible into English, an act of heresy because it promoted comprehension of biblical texts to the layperson, a privilege then reserved, of course, for the church. Church authorities did not smile upon Frith's description of Wycliffe as someone who was clean, pure, and unadulterated, and worse, like Wycliffe, Frith believed in obeying the call of one's inner thoughts and feelings, one's conscience, and then expressing those true thoughts and beliefs, damn the consequences. But the consequences were grave. For this and other reformist transgressions, John Frith was burned at the stake. They liked doing that a lot back then. Obeying one's sincere conscience, of course, was one of the central tenets of the Reformation. Martin Luther used the German word for sincerity, now I can show you my German, Aufrichtigkeit, 5 times in his famed 95 Theses alone, each time emphasizing how important it was for the believer to sincerely believe, to sincerely repent, or to sincerely feel a connection to God and not just pay lip service to the church. The great Swiss reformer John Calvin boldly stated in 1536, "The principal thing, that which God especially requires, is to bring a sincere heart." So this is a very, very important trait for all reformers leaders. Excuse me. In scores of Protestant religious tracts of the time, sincerity comes to acquire a moral value. So it shifts from this earlier use of describing physical things into describing a human trait, a human quality. And although a contemporary Catholic figure of the time, Michel de Montaigne, wrote perhaps the first truly expressive essays in 1588, at its origins, sincerity was a distinctly Protestant value. Now, for those of you familiar with your 17th century history, it'll come as no surprise to hear that it was mostly a century of some very, very sincere English people, the most devout of whom we call Puritans, who took for the sea to America. In one Puritan book, The Christian in Complete Armor, from 1655, the author uses the word sincere, sincerity, or sincerely 353 times in 930 pages, or roughly every 1.3 pages the word comes up. In another book, the word lands in the very title of a book for the first time, The Sincere Convert by Thomas Shepard, who helped create Harvard College by nudging John Harvard to donate his library for the creation of sincere Christians. By the 16th century, but the 16th century in France was one of courtly rules on the other side of the Atlantic, social protocol, table manners, civic diplomacy, and suppressing one's natural reactions. Class and social standing were what mattered, not what you really thought of them. Fit in or perish. Some social critics eventually tired of all these social rules and refinement. The great playwright Molière had written several plays making fun of how insincere the age had become. He wrote The Misanthrope, The Disaffected Young Ladies. That was a contemporary Parisian fashion at the time. About how superficial and detached society had become from its religious virtues. And Denis Diderot wrote a book called Rameau's Nephew, which spelled out the difference between the inward-leaning, sincere person and the outwardly obsequious manipulator. These writers, and here comes a key person, these writers deeply influenced Jean-Jacques Rousseau, a novelist, political philosopher, and if you read his biography, professional freeloader. It was he who transferred the religious value of sincerity into the secular realm with a moral and aesthetic force that would propel it forward for 100 years. In a direct reversal of his Calvinist forefathers, Rousseau was born Calvinist and then left the church and then came back again. Rousseau held that man was essentially good, something we've been talking about today, born free, and that society is what makes him insincere and bad and corrupt, and keeps him famously, as Rousseau wrote in The Social Contract, in chains. Man is born free, and everywhere he's in chains. He also wrote The Confessions, which are extremely revealing private moments from his life, a little too revealing. Letters of a Solitary Walker is another book he wrote. And in these, Rousseau expressed that the happy life was achieved by ridding oneself of the pressures of the outside world and living entirely from within, according to one's own inner compass against the grain of society. The plain and noble effusions of an honest soul, he wrote, speak a language far different from the insincere demonstrations of politeness and false appearances which the customs of the great world demand. And in his novel Emile, about the education of children, he wrote, "The essential worship is that of the heart. God does not reject its homage if it is sincere, in whatever form it is offered." Though both government and church alike were against Rousseau's message of strong individualism, of sincerity above all, his conviction that society corrupted the pure soul found enormous resonance among readers and among leaders of the French Revolution, who wanted to strip away the false mask of the bourgeoisie, which they eventually literally did by taking off their heads. Influenced as well by this call to sincerity were the Romantics, a European-wide cultural movement which took place between 1780 and 1830, roughly, before coming to America in the mid-19th century through the writings of figures like Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau, and Nathaniel Hawthorne, among a whole bunch of others. Romanticism, inspired originally by French, German, and English poets, propelled the idea of sincere art, so sincerity as a quality of the person, originally religious, but then moving that quality into the art that you make, whether it's visual art, whether it's poetry or essays. Art that truly expresses the artist's complex and ultimately mysterious self. That was the only thing that was valuable in art worth doing. It was the individual's sincerity above all. The great English Romantic poet William Wordsworth wrote in 1810, "When a man is treating an interesting subject, no faults have such killing power as those that prove that he is not in earnest." So you have to mean it. One reason that modern artists and poets and writers were so obsessed with sincerity was not just because of the increased importance given to the individual following the revolutions in the United States and in France, which, after all, were about individual rights, but also because they were living through a time of a tremendous change. The 19th century was the age of industrialization and commercialization. The old world based on agriculture, simple social ties, seasonal change, and strong religious belief was passing from view in this new modern world. And the new world of technology, secularism, and consumerism was on the rise. As a consequence, some critics thought that people were becoming unmoored from true values, becoming fake and too obsessed with money and materialism, and they have no sense of what really mattered. This book, Vanity Fair by William Thackeray, sharply criticized social superficiality based on sincerity. And while masses of people, there were these critics and these artists that were frustrated, but masses of people love this new culture for its products, its rising levels of income, decreased levels of poverty, new develops in hygiene, and medicine, great medicine at the time. Many artists and critics resorted to a critique of this new world based on the original religious values of sincerity and authenticity. Modern art was also based on religion. In fact, it is this very concern for the real over the fake, the sincere over the insincere, individual self-expression over modern mass advertising that motivates various strands of modern art in the 19th and 20th century, and the concern for human feeling. This painting, by the way, has been called the Mona Lisa of the modern, or Mona Lisa of the modern age. But developments in philosophy and psychology began to make sincerity less attractive than it had been. The influence of religion on the popular mind was on the wane, and figures like Friedrich Nietzsche called sincerity a weak virtue, that it helped to extinguish the strong biological values of manipulation, domination, and control in exchange for those of passivity and deference. Protestant Christianity, he wrote in Beyond Good and Evil, is that sincere, austere slave faith that gave the world Luther and Cromwell, or some other northern barbarian of the spirit who remained attached to his God and Christianity. He wasn't a fan of religion. Nietzsche wanted to return readers to the values of ancient Rome, crush the weak without remorse, be the Superman. That is sincerity. The ideas of Sigmund Freud were likewise deflating of the value. The fundamental human drives are not benevolence and altruism, but rather sex and violence. If we were truly to be sincere, we would only be sleeping with and fighting each other. In order to live together, however, we have to suppress these urges and therefore always live in a state of insincerity. And thus, civilization is largely responsible for our misery. For these and other reasons, the trait of sincerity and the Christian bourgeois culture it inspired comes to be questioned at the time, end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, returning many observers to a fascination with artifice and irony. The playwright Oscar Wilde wrote, "The first duty in life is to be as artificial as possible." He also said, the second duty, he doesn't know what that is. And his countryman, George Bernard Shaw, truly gave a blow to sincerity and said, it's dangerous to be sincere unless you're also stupid. This alternating play between sincerity and irony has played out entertainingly over the last century. From the cynicism of H.L. Mencken, this is him during Prohibition, The Lost Generation, Dorothy Parker, to the earnest croonings of Frank Sinatra and Nat King Cole, from the stiff 1950s, who were very earnest, to the rebellious agricultural longings of the hippie generation. The whole time this is going on, also art keeps doing what it's doing. Modern art inspired by Rousseau and by the Romantics, it used to fight against the inauthenticity of society with its sincerity, but in the 20th century, it slowly gave up. And it joined the ranks of commercialism and industrialization, all with an ironic twist, or actually, sometimes with no irony at all. This has resulted in artworks that have perfectly illustrated the joining of art and commerce. Works like this, or like this, or even this. Now that's going to stay there for about 2 minutes, so sorry. And thank you, Jeff Koons. At the same time, however, self-expressive sincerity found a home in music, in the folk songs of Joan Baez and Pete Seeger, and more recently in our own time, hopefully there's some fans, in the music of bands like the Fleet Foxes or Will Oldham or Bon Iver. Hipster culture generally, and here's where I really wish I had a few pictures, but ran out of time. Hipster culture generally has been able to animate irony and sincerity in a really interesting balance through fashion. Corporate culture has also long jumped onto the authenticity, sincerity bandwagon. You might recall phrases like think different, blaze your own trail, have it your way, for things like hamburgers. This has also been called, by a critic named Thomas Frank, commodifying your dissent. And so here we are. We're inspired to be sincere because of these religious and cultural origins. Each age, as I quickly tried to lay out, has used sincerity when it was needed and then discarded it when it was not. What began as a religious virtue becomes secularized and used as a weapon against society itself for being insincere. Sincerity, in this way, is cultural, not natural. And so we too teeter between irony and sincerity in our own age. This is something that the great and late writer David Foster Wallace thought was animating our own times, and I think he's right. So, thank you very much.